I'm back again. We are continuing with video clip 2. We are in week 2 of ECO736. This video clip continues from video clip 1. So in terms of measuring development, we move beyond your simple money metric indicators of income and production, which you are very familiar with from macroeconomics. We start trying to unpack structural issues. So we look at social indicators. So the World Bank classifies countries as either low income, lower middle income, higher middle income, or high income countries, which also include your OECD countries. So South Africa is a typical middle income country, but we've got both higher middle income features as well as lower middle income features. If you look at our income and production indicators, we are clearly higher middle income. But when you look at our social indicators, we are lower middle income. And the next slide will show that clearly. Okay, it's not this slide, but the one afterwards. I'll come back to it again. But over here, basically, you've got your different classifications: low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income. And here you've got your different indicators, whether it's by health or by money metric measures. And you can see what the averages are for the different classifications. And you can just compare that to your global averages. And this, you can get all this data from the World Bank if you have time and data, airtime, I mean. Please go and check that up. So this is actually the slide I was referring to earlier, where you can see with South Africa, we've got higher middle income features when you look at your indicators like GNI per capita and other production indicators. But when you look at our social indicators like life expectancy, we've got more lower middle income. Okay, the next slide is just going to demonstrate that economic growth matters. It's important if we want to have economic development as well, even though the emphasis is on it being sustained. So this graph shows us what South Africa's 2014 GDP would have been if growth since 1990 had been as per other countries. So if South Africa was growing at the rate other countries were growing at, what would their GDP have been like? And if you look at this, you can see that if we had to grow at the rate at which, let's say for example, okay, this is at India's growth rate, which was 6.9% since 1990, then in 2014, our GDP would have been $944 billion, okay, when in actual fact it was $367 billion. What about the relationship between income and happiness? A country's income, in this case proxied by income per head in dollars, and some kind of happiness index. Well, it appears as if those countries that are richer also tend to be happier, okay? And South Africa, we comparatively are not very rich, okay? And yet our happiness levels, it's at about 70 out of 100, which is not too bad, okay? But this is a snapshot. I wonder what it would look like if we looked at this over a period of time. Well, if we look at the relationship between income and happiness in one country, like the US, for example, over a period of time, it would appear that as GDP per head increased, the proportion of people who said they were very happy seemed to decrease. Okay, so this is a very crude measurement. I mean, because we're dealing with GDP per head, this really, it doesn't give us too much information because we're not sure how this GDP is distributed. Remember, inequality plays a big role. So GDP overall could have increased, but if only a few were getting very rich and the rest were getting poorer, then it does make sense that your proportion of people who were very unhappy would be declining. Okay? And you might be wondering, why are we looking at income and happiness? Remember, development, looking at how a country develops, we're looking at it as a social progress which goes beyond just economic growth. So we look at other structural underlying issues which are linked to social indicators, of which we said health and education can be a few. But more recently, economists have also started looking at other proxies like happiness as an indicator for whether a country is developed or not. So from that perspective, it's pointless that you could be the richest country in the world, but yet have very high suicide rates or high depression rates. That does not speak to development. It speaks to economic growth, yes, but it doesn't speak to development at all. And so this is just a reminder that you need to think beyond simply GDP per head and your traditional kind of macroeconomic indicators, because it could be very misleading in terms of where that country or how developed that country actually is. I know, for example, Sweden, which is a high-income country, they have one of the highest suicide rates in the world. Japan as well. And one could argue, yes, that the quality of life may be good there, but why are those people so unhappy? And you do have some development economists who look at those type of research questions. So something that might be worthwhile discussing is the economist's point of departure in welfare economics, that is Pareto optimum, where basically the effect on welfare, on societal welfare, is unclear if one person benefits at the cost of another. And this is because an interpersonal comparison of those two people's utilities are impossible. So basically, no conclusion can be drawn about welfare change when we're dealing with a zero-sum game, when we make the assumption that the pie is just one size. Okay? For those of you who did public economics, you would be very familiar with this. Again, if you have time and if you have data, airtime to go online, go to gapminder.org and you can look at different relationships between different proxies, whether it's income proxies and social proxies. You can look at the relationship between those by country. Over here we've got South Africa, and there are a whole host of other countries over there, but you can just look at these different indicators and see how South Africa compares to other countries. You can do it by income and fertility as well. So yeah, there's a lot of data behind development economics. A lot of the latest literature is empirical in nature. So there is lots for you to look at online and to compare where South Africa features when compared to other countries. So do that if you have time. Just now, specifically to highlight South Africa's extreme inequality. In fact, we are the most unequal country when it comes to income distribution in the world. Okay? We have the highest Gini coefficient in the world. And if you, that's quite a statement to make. And a lot of this is driven by race because of apartheid, but you can also look at it by quintiles, where quintile 1 is your poorest quintile and quintile 5 is your richest quintile. But you can see that South African whites, this was 1995 data, but South African whites, basically, when you compare them to other countries, they are up here with like Austria, the USA, etc., all those OECD countries. But if you look at, for example, South African black population, it's far further down the income spectrum. Look at our quintile 1 over here, which is our poorest 20% in South Africa, and they are in the company income-wise with those in Tanzania, Congo, Angola. Okay, so within one country, which is South Africa, you have people living a very high income lifestyle, and others who are living an extremely low income type of existence. And this is probably the saddest thing. And it comes with a lot of other knock-on effects, this inequality, but we'll talk more about that at a later stage. So I've also kept some time aside in this lecture for you guys to go back to your undergraduate work, and if you haven't done development in the undergraduate work, you can just go and read a little bit on development history, looking at colonialism, when the Marshall Plan came in, institutions like the World Bank, and all of these other points mentioned here. These have been covered in your development courses. You can look at dualism, some of the theories there, Rostow and the phases of development mentioned over there. Different obstacles to development, depends on who you speak to. Again, just to highlight that development economics, besides the empirical component, the theoretical component, you can really think of it as being normative economics, where a lot of it is opinion based. Okay, it's not positive economics, it's normative economics. So if you're conservative, you'll say, well, culture is an obstacle to development. Liberals, they have other views on barriers to development. Radicals have their own views, and it's purely opinion based, this aspect of development economics. When we look at the empirical literature, that is positive economics, because it's data driven. You are dealing specifically with facts. But development economics encompasses both sides of that. You can also spend some time looking or revising the development of development thinking. Go back to your textbook, to Darrow, and there's some literature on that over there. But really, we have moved away in development economics from focusing on capital and macro indicators, which I've said over and over in these video clips. Right now, our emphasis is more on microstructural mechanisms which underlie what manifests in a country eventually. The emphasis is on people, on the human capital, their health, their education, what is going right there, what is going wrong there, and then how that then feeds into the economy's development. So moving from the hard issues to the soft issues, which are sometimes more difficult to measure, but that doesn't make it less important. In fact, it's often the most important issues when it comes to why countries develop or do not develop. If you are looking at, for example, years of education, if you look at how it has increased over time from the 1950s to the 2010s, you can see, irrespective whether you're in an advanced country or a developing country, years of education has increased greatly. Okay, but when we move deeper into the education literature, we will start talking about the trade-offs between quantity and quality. Okay, so initially in development policy, people were pushing for quantity, increase the years of education. We will see it translate into a greater economic growth, greater economic development. But then we found, or empirical work showed us that, yes, it's good to increase the quantity of education, which is years of education, but at the same time, the quality of the education needs to increase too. And so these are things that we'll be looking at in more detail later on. So this is where I'd like to just end off for today. This is the penultimate slide, I think. Yeah. We'll pick up some of these items again in the discussion forum on Thursday at 9:25. Good luck with your first reading assignment, and enjoy week 2 in development economics. Goodbye.